My name is Catalina Reeves, and 3 months ago, I discovered that my parents had sold my wedding venue, the one I'd been planning for 2 years, to pay off my brother's gambling debts. But that betrayal was nothing compared to what happened when my fiancé's father, retired Admiral Theodore Ashworth, worth $2.3 billion, found out what my family had done to me. What followed was a masterclass in how real power handles injustice and why some battles require heavy artillery. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The text that shattered my world came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning as I was preparing for my shift at Riverside Children's Hospital in Millbrook Heights. I'm a pediatric nurse, and Tuesdays are always our busiest days in the cardiac unit. I was double-checking my patient assignments when my phone buzzed with a message from my father, Gregory Reeves. "Sold Oceanview Manor. Family emergency. Your brother needed help. The deposit will cover it. Wedding can wait. Family comes first." My hands trembled as I read those words. Oceanview Manor, the stunning clifftop venue overlooking Sapphire Bay that I'd booked 18 months ago, the place where I was supposed to marry Lieutenant Commander James Ashworth in just 6 weeks, the venue that required a $25,000 non-refundable deposit, my entire inheritance from my grandmother, Patricia Caldwell, who had specifically left me that money for my wedding day. I called my father immediately, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Dad, please tell me this is some kind of mistake. You can't have sold my wedding venue." His voice was cold, matter-of-fact, the same tone he'd used throughout my childhood when delivering disappointing news. "Catalina, grow up. Your brother Damien owes some very dangerous people $80,000. They were threatening to break his legs. What's more important, one day of celebration or your brother's safety?" "My wedding isn't just one day of celebration," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "And that wasn't your money to use. Grandma Patricia left that inheritance specifically for my wedding day." "Money is money," he replied dismissively. "Besides, you're marrying into wealth now. The Ashworths can afford a better venue anyway. Consider it their contribution to the family." The audacity took my breath away. My father, who had never contributed a single dollar to my education, my career, or my life, was now dictating how my future in-laws should spend their money. The same man who had borrowed $3,000 from me last year for temporary car repairs and never repaid it. The same man who convinced my mother to cash out my college fund when I was 16, claiming they'd pay it back with interest when his construction business took off. Spoiler alert, it never did. But this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about my brother Damien, the 28-year-old perpetual disappointment who had been bailed out of trouble more times than I could count. Drug possession charges at 19, my parents hired an expensive lawyer using money they borrowed against their house. A DUI at 23, they paid for rehabilitation and legal fees. Credit card debt, student loans for a degree he never finished, and now, apparently, gambling debts to dangerous people. Every crisis was an emergency that required the family to sacrifice for Damien's sake. Every penny that could have gone toward my future disappeared into the black hole of his poor decisions. The pattern was devastatingly familiar. Throughout my childhood, every family decision revolved around managing Damien's latest crisis. Christmas presents were modest because Damien needed money for school supplies that never materialized. Family vacations were canceled because Damien had gotten in trouble and needed immediate attention. My high school graduation dinner was held at a chain restaurant instead of the nice place my parents had initially promised because Damien had crashed his car the week before, and they needed to cover the insurance deductible. I had learned early to expect nothing and be grateful for the crumbs. When I won a scholarship to nursing school, my parents' reaction wasn't pride, it was relief that they wouldn't have to contribute financially to my education. When I graduated with honors and landed my dream job at Riverside Children's Hospital, their response was tepid acknowledgement, followed by a request for me to help with Damien's rent because he was between opportunities. But this, stealing my wedding venue money, was different. This crossed a line I hadn't even known existed.
"Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need that money back. The venue contract had a specific cancellation policy. Since you canceled less than 60 days before the event, we lose the entire deposit. That's $25,000 of my inheritance gone." "Gone to help your brother," he corrected. "Family helps family, Catalina. You've always been the responsible one. Damien needs us right now."
And what about what I need? What about James? What about our families who are flying in from across the country? What about the 150 guests who have already booked hotels? You'll figure it out. You always do. The Ashworths have connections. They can find you another venue. That's when I realized something had fundamentally shifted inside me. For the first time in my 26 years, I wasn't going to figure it out for everyone else's convenience. I wasn't going to absorb another family crisis and smile while doing it. And I definitely wasn't going to ask my fiancé's family to clean up my family's mess. But what my father didn't know, what none of them knew, was that James had already told his father about my family's history of financial manipulation. Admiral Theodore Ashworth hadn't built a multi-billion-dollar empire and commanded naval operations across 3 continents by being naive about people who prey on kindness. And when he learned what my parents had done with my wedding money, he didn't just offer to help, he declared war. Before I tell you exactly how a billionaire admiral handles family members who choose money over their children, and why my parents would soon learn the difference between having problems and being the problem, I need you to understand something. If you're watching this video, chances are you've experienced something similar. Maybe not this exact situation, but that familiar feeling of being the responsible one who gets punished for other people's poor choices. The family member who gets their boundaries trampled because they're strong enough to handle it. I want you to drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from, and more importantly, if you've ever had family members prioritize money over your happiness. Hit that like button if you believe that family loyalty shouldn't be a one-way street, and subscribe because this story is about to show you what happens when someone with real power decides to stand up for justice. Trust me, you won't want to miss what Admiral Ashworth did to my parents when he found out they had stolen from his future daughter-in-law. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's letting someone with unlimited resources and military precision show your enemies what accountability actually looks like. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Before I dive deeper into how my family's betrayal unfolded and what Admiral Ashworth did about it, I want to connect with all of you watching. The response to my story has been absolutely overwhelming, and I can see from your comments that so many of you have experienced similar situations with family members who prioritize money over relationships. Sarah from Denver wrote, "My parents took my college fund to bail out my alcoholic uncle. I'm still paying student loans at 35. Marcus from Toronto shared, "My family expects me to fund my sister's 3rd failed business. Well, I can barely afford rent." And Jennifer from Atlanta said, "They told me family comes first, but apparently that only applies when they need something from me." If you're nodding along to any of these comments, you're exactly who I'm making this video for. This isn't just my story, it's our story. It's the story of every responsible family member who gets financially exploited because we're seen as the reliable one who will always figure it out. I want you to know that what happened to me doesn't have to happen to you. There are warning signs, there are boundaries you can set, and yes, there are ways to fight back when family members cross the line from asking for help to outright theft. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how to recognize financial manipulation within families and, more importantly, how to protect yourself from it. But first, I need to share the rest of my story, because what Admiral Ashworth did to my parents when he discovered their pattern of behavior was nothing short of legendary. We're talking about a man who built a shipping empire worth billions, commanded naval operations across 3 continents, and has connections in every major industry you can imagine. When someone like that decides to teach your family a lesson about respect and boundaries, it's not just justice, it's an education. Here's what I want you to do right now. Hit that like button if you've ever been the family ATM. Drop a comment telling me about your own experience with financially manipulative relatives. I read every single one, and your stories help other viewers realize they're not alone. And definitely subscribe with notifications on, because this channel is dedicated to stories about standing up to toxic family dynamics, workplace manipulation, and anyone who thinks they can take advantage of kind-hearted people.
I also want to address something I've been seeing in the comments. Some of you are asking if this story is real, and I understand the skepticism. When I first started telling people about what my parents did and how Admiral Ashworth responded, even I could barely believe it was happening. But here's the thing about having billions of dollars and decades of military leadership experience. You don't just have resources, you have systems. You have people who know people, and when you've spent an entire career solving complex problems under pressure, handling one family's financial abuse isn't just possible, it's Tuesday. For those asking about proof, I've included screenshots and documentation throughout this story where appropriate, always with privacy considerations in mind. Some details have been changed to protect identities, but the core events happened exactly as I'm describing them. Admiral Ashworth didn't just help me. He taught me that the difference between being generous and being exploited comes down to one thing: consequences. Now, I also want to take a moment to address the viewers who might be thinking, well, family is family. Maybe she should have just helped her brother. To those people, I want you to imagine this. What if your family took your entire wedding fund without asking? What if they had a history of taking your money for someone else's mistakes? What if every major milestone in your life was interrupted by someone else's crisis that somehow became your financial responsibility? Family love isn't measured by how much money you're willing to lose for someone else's poor decisions. Real family love involves respect, boundaries, and considering each other's feelings before making decisions that affect everyone. What my parents did wasn't family loyalty, it was theft wrapped in emotional manipulation. The viewers who truly understand this are sharing stories that break my heart and inspire me at the same time. Emma from Phoenix wrote, "I gave my parents $50,000 over 5 years to help with my brother's addiction. He's still using, and I'm still broke." David from Chicago shared, "They took my inheritance to fund my sister's wedding, then acted shocked when I couldn't afford to be in the wedding party." These stories matter because they show a pattern that extends far beyond my individual experience. There's an entire category of family abuse that happens specifically around money, and it's often invisible because it gets disguised as helping family or being the bigger person. What makes my story different isn't just that I finally said no. It's that I had someone with the resources and determination to make sure there were real consequences. Admiral Ashworth didn't just offer to pay for a new venue, though he absolutely did that too. He made sure my parents understood that financial manipulation has a cost, and sometimes that cost is higher than they ever imagined. If you're someone who's currently dealing with financially manipulative family members, I want you to pay close attention to what happens next in my story. Not because you need a billionaire admiral to solve your problems, but because the principles he used, documentation, consequences, and refusing to enable bad behavior, are strategies anyone can implement. And for those of you supporting someone who's going through this kind of family manipulation, your role is crucial too. Sometimes the person being exploited can't see the pattern clearly because they're too close to it. Having someone from the outside validate that what's happening isn't normal or acceptable can be life-changing. So stick with me through this entire story.
Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember that your worth isn't determined by how much financial abuse you're willing to tolerate in the name of family harmony. Because what Admiral Ashworth showed me is that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family members who are behaving badly is to stop enabling their behavior and start enforcing consequences. And when those consequences come from someone with the resources to make them truly educational, well, that's when real change happens. Now, let me tell you about the phone call that changed everything. To understand how devastating my parents' betrayal truly was, you need to know about the two very different worlds that were about to collide. On one side, you had the Reeves family of Millbrook Heights, a middle-class household where financial crisis was a permanent resident and responsibility always seemed to flow in one direction. On the other side, you had the Ashworth dynasty, a family where wealth wasn't just inherited, it was strategically built across generations through military service, business acumen, and an unwavering code of honor. Let me start with my family, because their dynamics shaped everything that happened next. The Reeves household operated under what I now recognize as a deeply dysfunctional financial hierarchy. At the top sat my father, Gregory Reeves, a 54-year-old contractor whose construction business seemed to alternate between about to take off and temporarily struggling with suspicious regularity. Gregory had perfected the art of financial optimism. Every failed project was just a stepping stone to the next big opportunity. Every debt was temporary, and every request for money from family members was framed as an investment in our collective future.
My mother, Linda Reeves, played the role of enabler with Academy Award-worthy performance. A part-time bookkeeper at a local dental office, she earned just enough to contribute to household expenses while maintaining the family's emotional equilibrium. Linda had mastered the language of guilt-based financial manipulation. We're all in this together. Family takes care of family. And her personal favorite, your grandmother would have wanted you to help your brother. She specialized in making every family financial crisis sound like a moral test that only heartless people would fail. Then there was my brother Damien, the 28-year-old gravitational center around which all family drama orbited. Damien possessed a truly remarkable talent for turning minor problems into major catastrophes that required immediate family intervention. He'd started college 3 times without finishing, launched 2 businesses that collapsed within months, and had a relationship with money that could best be described as mutually destructive. Damien didn't just make bad financial decisions, he made expensive bad financial decisions with confidence and charm that somehow convinced people to fund his next inevitable failure. What made Damien particularly dangerous to family stability was his ability to generate genuine emergencies. This wasn't a case of wanting money for luxuries or convenience. Damien created situations where real consequences loomed: eviction notices, repo men, angry creditors, and now, apparently, people who would break his legs if he didn't pay up. This pattern meant that every request for help came with urgent deadlines and dramatic stakes that made saying no seem heartless. My role in this family system was crystal clear. I was the responsible one, the problem solver, the family member who could be counted on to absorb financial shocks without creating additional drama. Since graduating nursing school and landing my position at Riverside Children's Hospital, I'd become the family's unofficial emergency fund. My steady income, minimal expenses, and conflict-avoidant personality made me the perfect target for financial requests that always seemed reasonable individually, but added up to systematic exploitation. The requests followed a predictable pattern. First came the crisis explanation, usually involving Damien, but sometimes affecting the whole family. Then came the temporary framing, just until we get back on our feet, or we'll pay you back as soon as the insurance check comes through.
Next was the guilt application, references to family loyalty, reminders of everything they'd done for me growing up, and subtle implications that refusing would make me selfish. Finally, came the gratitude expectation. I was supposed to feel good about helping, never mention repayment, and certainly never track how much the family owed me. This system had been operating smoothly for years, until I met James Ashworth. Lieutenant Commander James Ashworth represented everything my family wasn't: financial stability, emotional maturity, and a support system that actually supported rather than drained. At 31, James had already distinguished himself in naval service, earning commendations for leadership during complex international operations. But what drew me to him wasn't his impressive military record or his family's wealth. It was the way he approached problems with calm analysis rather than dramatic crisis management. James came from a family where money was a tool for creating opportunities rather than a source of constant anxiety. The Ashworth family operated with military precision when it came to finances, clear budgets, long-term planning, and decisions based on logic rather than emotional manipulation. When James told me about his family's approach to money, it was like discovering that some families actually functioned without constant financial drama. The Ashworth patriarch, Admiral Theodore Ashworth, had built his reputation commanding naval operations in the Pacific before transitioning to civilian life, where he'd constructed a shipping empire that now controlled maritime logistics across 15 countries. At 67, Admiral Ashworth possessed the rare combination of old-school military discipline and modern business innovation that had transformed his initial naval pension into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. Admiral Ashworth's wealth wasn't just impressive in scale, it was strategic in application. He didn't simply accumulate money, he deployed it with military precision to solve problems, create opportunities, and ensure his family's long-term security. His approach to business reflected his naval training: thorough intelligence gathering, careful planning, decisive action, and absolute accountability for results. But what made Admiral Ashworth truly formidable wasn't his wealth or his business success, it was his code of honor. Military service had instilled in him an unwavering belief that actions have consequences, that integrity matters more than convenience, and that protecting people under his command was a sacred responsibility. When James became engaged to me, I automatically fell under Admiral Ashworth's protective umbrella, though I didn't fully understand what that meant until my parents made their catastrophic mistake. The cultural clash between these two families had been evident from our first meeting 6 months earlier. When James brought me home to meet his parents at their estate in Harborview Hills, the contrast with my own family gatherings was startling. Conversation focused on current events, travel experiences, and future plans, rather than crisis management and damage control. No one asked anyone for money, complained about financial stress, or expected other family members to solve their problems.
Admiral Ashworth and his wife, Catherine, welcomed me with genuine warmth that didn't come with hidden agendas or unspoken expectations. Catherine, a former ambassador's daughter who'd managed diplomatic social events across 3 continents, possessed the kind of effortless grace that made everyone feel included without making anyone feel indebted. Their home reflected their values: comfortable elegance without ostentation, military precision without rigidity, and an atmosphere of security that I'd never experienced in my own family. When my parents met the Ashworths at our engagement party, the differences became even more pronounced. Gregory immediately began dropping hints about his construction business and how military contracts might provide interesting opportunities. Linda kept mentioning how expensive weddings were becoming and how fortunate young couples were when they had family support. Even Damien, who'd somehow managed to attend without creating a crisis that week, made comments about the Ashworth estate and how generous wealthy families could be.
I was mortified by my family's transparent attempts to position themselves for financial benefit from my engagement. But Admiral Ashworth, with decades of experience reading people's motivations, simply observed and filed the information away for future reference. He was too polite to comment, but I could see him analyzing my family's dynamics with the same strategic assessment he'd once applied to potential naval threats. James, bless him, never made me feel ashamed of my family's behavior. He understood that I couldn't control their actions, and he loved me for who I was, rather than judging me for where I came from. But he also began sharing more details about his family's history with me, particularly his father's approach to dealing with people who tried to exploit family connections for financial gain. My father has dealt with fortune hunters, business scammers, and family members who suddenly became very friendly when they needed money, James explained one evening as we walked along the harbor. He's learned to distinguish between people who genuinely care about family and people who see family as a business opportunity. Looking back, I realized James was preparing me for what would eventually happen. He knew his father well enough to predict that if my family ever crossed certain lines, Admiral Ashworth wouldn't just offer help, he'd take action to ensure the problem never occurred again. The stage was perfectly set for the confrontation that would change everything. On one side, a family accustomed to financial manipulation, crisis creation, and exploiting the responsible member's guilt and loyalty. On the other, a military strategist with unlimited resources, international connections, and a code of honor that demanded consequences for people who prey on others. My parents had no idea they were about to discover the difference between borrowing money from their daughter and stealing from Admiral Theodore Ashworth's future daughter-in-law. The theft of my wedding venue money wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of 26 years of systematic financial exploitation that I'd been too conditioned to recognize as abuse. When I finally sat down to document the pattern for Admiral Ashworth, the numbers were staggering, but more importantly, the methodology was chillingly consistent. My parents had turned financial manipulation into an art form, and I'd been their unwitting masterpiece. The pattern began early, though I didn't understand it at the time. When I turned 16 and got my first job at Sunset Diner, a local restaurant in downtown Millbrook Heights, my parents established what they called contribution expectations. Since I was living under their roof and benefiting from family resources, they explained, it was only fair that I contribute to household expenses. The amount started small, $150 a month from my part-time wages, but the principle they established would govern our relationship for the next decade. What made this particularly insidious was how they framed it as financial education. Learning to contribute to the household teaches responsibility, my mother Linda would say when I occasionally questioned why my friends didn't pay their parents' rent. We're preparing you for the real world. The real world, apparently, was one in which your family members were your landlords and creditors rather than your support system. By my senior year of high school, my contribution had increased to $250 monthly, which represented nearly half my income from the diner. When I asked if this money was being saved for my college expenses, my father Gregory laughed and said, "This is your college education, learning how the world really works." The money, of course, disappeared into general household expenses. Though, mysteriously, these contributions never seemed to improve our family's financial situation. The college fund incident was my first real lesson in how my parents weaponized family loyalty against financial boundaries. My grandmother Patricia had established a modest college fund for me when I was born, contributing small amounts each year until it reached nearly $8,000 by my 18th birthday. This represented the only money specifically designated for my future, and I'd built my entire college plan around its existence.
3 months before graduation, my father announced that the college fund would need to be temporarily redirected to cover emergency repairs on our house.
The foundation had developed cracks, he explained, and immediate attention was required to prevent catastrophic structural damage. The repairs were estimated at exactly $7,800, nearly the entire college fund, and delaying them could result in our family losing our home. Think of it as an investment in all our futures, my mother Linda explained when I expressed devastation about losing my college money. Once the house is stabilized, we can take out a home equity loan to replace your college fund, probably with even more money than you had before. The house repairs happened, but the home equity loan never materialized. Instead, I learned that protecting the family's financial interests meant sacrificing my own educational opportunities. This established the template that would govern every subsequent financial crisis. Damien, or my parents, would create an emergency, I would be expected to provide the solution, and my compliance would be framed as evidence of my character and family loyalty. Refusing to help would make me selfish, greedy, and ungrateful for everything the family had provided me. College became a 4-year exercise in creative financial juggling. Without the promised college fund, I qualified for work-study programs, took out student loans, and worked additional shifts at the diner during breaks and summers. Every semester brought new financial challenges that somehow became my responsibility to solve. When my father's construction business experienced what he called temporary cash flow problems, I was asked to cover his truck payment for just 2 months. When my mother needed dental work not covered by insurance, I was the obvious choice to provide the $1,200 for crowns and fillings. The most egregious incident occurred during my junior year when I received a $3,000 scholarship for academic excellence in my nursing program. I'd worked tirelessly to maintain the GPA required for this competitive award, viewing it as validation of my efforts and a crucial contribution to my educational expenses. The scholarship check arrived on a Friday afternoon, and I deposited it immediately, planning to use it for next semester's textbooks and clinical supplies. By Monday morning, my father had convinced me to sign a temporary loan document, transferring the scholarship money to help him secure a large construction contract that would set our family up for years. The contract required upfront material purchases, he explained, and his business credit was temporarily strained due to late payments from previous clients. If I could just lend him the scholarship money for 60 days, he'd return it with interest and probably throw in a bonus for helping him secure such a lucrative opportunity. The construction contract fell through, as most of my father's deals seemed to do, and my scholarship money vanished into the same financial void that had consumed my college fund and countless other contributions over the years. When I asked for repayment, my father became genuinely angry, reminding me that he'd provided for me for 18 years without sending me bills for food, housing, and utilities. Surely I could afford to help him once without treating him like a business transaction. This guilt-based reasoning became their standard response to any request for repayment or accountability. When I suggested keeping records of loans and contributions, my mother accused me of treating family relationships like business arrangements. When I asked for timelines for repayment, my father reminded me that family members don't put conditions on their support. When I mentioned feeling taken advantage of, both parents accused me of being influenced by friends who didn't understand how real families operate. The pattern accelerated after I graduated nursing school and began earning a steady income at Riverside Children's Hospital. Suddenly, my parents' financial emergencies became more frequent and more expensive. Damien's crisis creation skills also evolved, progressing from minor inconveniences to situations requiring immediate and substantial financial intervention. The car incident happened just 8 months after I started working full-time. Damien had borrowed my parents' second car for what he claimed was a job interview, but was actually a trip to Riverside Casino, where he'd accumulated significant gambling debts. In his desperation to win back his losses, he'd used the car as collateral for additional loans from what he described as unofficial lenders. When he couldn't repay these loans, the car was seized, leaving my parents without reliable transportation for my father's work. Rather than holding Damien accountable for his deception and poor judgment, my parents immediately began planning how to solve the crisis.
They needed $4,500 for a replacement vehicle, and their credit was too poor to secure an auto loan. Once again, I became the solution to someone else's problem. The request was framed as a family emergency that required immediate action, and my steady income made me the obvious choice to provide assistance. I agreed to co-sign an auto loan, believing my parents when they assured me they would handle all payments and that my credit was just needed for approval. 6 months later, I discovered they'd missed 3 payments, and my credit score had significantly dropped. When I confronted them, they seemed genuinely surprised that I was upset, explaining that they had assumed I understood that co-signing meant I was responsible for the debt. The credit card incident represented perhaps the most sophisticated example of their financial manipulation. My mother approached me with what seemed like a reasonable request. She wanted to add me as an authorized user on a new credit card to help me establish credit history while giving her access to funds for household emergencies. This seemed like a win-win arrangement that would benefit both of us.
What I didn't understand was that being an authorized user meant that my mother's spending appeared on my credit report, and her payments, or lack thereof, directly affected my credit score. Over 18 months, she accumulated $6,800 in debt on this card while making only minimum payments. When I discovered the situation and asked to be removed as an authorized user, she became emotionally distraught, explaining that losing access to this credit would create genuine hardship for the family. Rather than simply removing me from the account, I made the mistake of paying off the entire balance to protect my credit, essentially purchasing my freedom from their debt for nearly $7,000. My mother was appropriately grateful and promised this would never happen again. 6 months later, she asked if I'd consider co-signing for a small personal loan to help consolidate the remaining debt. Each incident followed the same pattern: crisis creation, emotional manipulation, financial extraction, and then a return to normal family dynamics, until the next emergency arose. What made this pattern particularly effective was how my parents had trained me to feel guilty for having financial stability while they struggled. My steady income and responsible money management weren't seen as personal achievements. They were viewed as family resources that should be shared during difficult times. The engagement ring incident occurred just 3 months before my wedding venue was stolen, and it should have been my final warning about their escalating financial desperation. When James proposed with his grandmother's stunning vintage engagement ring, my parents' reaction wasn't joy or excitement, it was immediate appraisal. My mother spent the entire engagement party asking detailed questions about the ring's value, its insurance coverage, and whether the Ashworth family had other valuable jewelry. 2 weeks after the engagement party, my father approached me with what he described as a temporary request. Damien owed money to someone who was becoming increasingly aggressive about collection, and they needed $2,500 immediately to prevent serious consequences. Rather than asking for cash this time, he suggested I temporarily pawn my engagement ring to raise the needed funds. The ring could be redeemed within 30 days, he assured me, and no one except immediate family would ever know it happened. When I refused, explaining that pawning James's grandmother's ring would be a betrayal of his trust and potentially destroy our relationship, my father became genuinely angry. He accused me of valuing material possessions over family welfare and suggested that my upcoming marriage to wealth had made me forget where I came from. My mother supported his position, tearfully explaining that they'd never ask if they weren't truly desperate. The emotional manipulation was so intense that I almost agreed, but something inside me finally recognized the insanity of risking my engagement to solve my brother's gambling problem. I stood firm, and for the first time in my adult life, I told my parents no without providing an alternative solution. The consequences were immediate: 3 days of silent treatment, followed by passive-aggressive comments about my selfishness, and finally, emotional appeals about family loyalty that made me question my own judgment. This was the context in which my parents stole my wedding venue money. They'd spent over a decade training me to absorb their financial crises without complaint, and my recent refusal to pawn my engagement ring had demonstrated that my compliance could no longer be taken for granted. The wedding venue theft wasn't just about solving Damien's immediate gambling debt.
It was about reasserting their control over my financial resources and reminding me that family obligations superseded personal boundaries. What they didn't anticipate was that this time, I wouldn't be facing their manipulation alone. What made my parents' theft of the wedding venue money particularly devastating wasn't just the amount, it was the timing. For the first time in my adult life, everything was finally falling into place. I'd achieved a level of professional success, personal happiness, and financial stability that seemed almost too good to be true. Looking back, I realized my parents chose to strike precisely when I had the most to lose, when their betrayal would inflict maximum emotional and practical damage. The foundation of my new life was my position at Riverside Children's Hospital, where I had recently been promoted to senior pediatric nurse in the cardiac intensive care unit. This wasn't just any promotion. It represented recognition of 5 years of dedicated service, specialized training, and the kind of clinical excellence that hospitals compete to retain. The position came with a substantial salary increase to $78,000 annually, comprehensive benefits, and most importantly, the respect of colleagues who'd watched me grow from a nervous new graduate into a confident medical professional. Working in pediatric cardiac care required emotional resilience, technical precision, and the ability to support families during the most terrifying experiences of their lives. Children as young as newborns underwent complex heart surgeries, and their families looked to nurses like me for reassurance, education, and advocacy during impossible circumstances. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply meaningful, and I had found my calling in helping these families navigate their medical crises.
My supervisor, Dr. Rachel Montenegro, had become not just a professional mentor, but a trusted friend who'd watched me transform from someone who apologized for taking up space into a nurse who commanded respect in high-pressure situations. Catalina has developed into exactly the kind of clinical leader we hope to cultivate, she had written in my promotion review. Her combination of technical competence and emotional intelligence makes her invaluable to our most challenging cases. The promotion had also brought me into closer collaboration with the hospital's cardiac surgery team, including Dr. Benjamin Cross, the chief of pediatric cardiac surgery, who'd specifically requested that I be assigned to his most complex cases. This level of professional recognition was something I dreamed about but never dared expect, and it represented validation that my career was finally moving beyond survival mode into genuine success. Beyond the professional recognition, my financial situation had stabilized for the first time since college. The salary increase, combined with careful budgeting and my refusal to continue funding my family's crises, had allowed me to build an emergency fund of $12,000 and begin contributing to a retirement account. More importantly, I'd been able to save the $25,000 inheritance from my grandmother specifically for my wedding, protecting it from family emergencies by opening a separate savings account that my parents couldn't access. This financial independence represented more than just money. It symbolized my ability to make decisions based on my own priorities, rather than constantly reacting to other people's emergencies. For the first time, I could plan for the future, rather than simply surviving each financial crisis as it arose. The wedding fund represented my commitment to building a life with James that wouldn't be constantly derailed by my family's dysfunction. My relationship with James had also reached a level of stability and happiness that sometimes left me wondering if I deserved such contentment. We'd been together for 18 months, and every aspect of our partnership continued to deepen and strengthen. James understood my family background without judging me for it, supported my career ambitions without competing with them, and had introduced me to what healthy family dynamics actually looked like. Our engagement had been a masterpiece of thoughtfulness that perfectly illustrated the differences between James's approach to life and my family's crisis-driven existence. Rather than a dramatic surprise proposal that prioritized spectacle over meaning, James had planned an intimate evening that honored both our relationship and our individual interests. He'd arranged for us to visit the Millbrook Heights lighthouse, a place that had become special to us during our early dating period, and proposed at sunset with his grandmother's ring while a small group of our closest friends waited nearby with champagne and celebration. The engagement itself had been a source of genuine joy rather than stress.
which was a revelation for someone accustomed to family celebrations that inevitably became financial crises. James's family had welcomed me with warmth that didn't come with hidden expectations or unspoken conditions. Admiral Ashworth and Catherine had treated me as an individual worthy of respect, rather than a potential solution to their problems. Planning our wedding had become a collaborative project that reflected our shared values and vision for our future. We'd chosen Oceanview Manor not just for its stunning location overlooking Sapphire Bay, but because it represented the kind of elegant simplicity we both preferred. The venue was sophisticated without being ostentatious, beautiful without being extravagant, and large enough to accommodate both our families while maintaining an intimate atmosphere.
What struck me most about the Ashworth family's involvement in our wedding was how they treated it as a joyful celebration rather than a financial negotiation. There were no subtle hints about cost sharing, no suggestions that certain expenses were unreasonable, and no attempts to control decisions through financial leverage. This stood in stark contrast to my own family's immediate focus on wedding costs and their transparent hints about expecting financial assistance from the Ashworths. My professional success had also begun attracting attention beyond Riverside Children's Hospital. Dr. Montenegro had nominated me for the Regional Excellence in Pediatric Nursing Award, a prestigious recognition that could significantly advance my career prospects. The nomination process required extensive documentation of clinical achievements, patient outcomes, and professional development, all of which highlighted how far I'd come since my difficult early years of trying to balance family financial crises with career demands. Additionally, I had been invited to present a case study at the National Pediatric Cardiac Care Conference, an opportunity that would establish me as a thought leader in my field and potentially open doors to advanced practice opportunities. The presentation would focus on innovative family support strategies during pediatric cardiac surgery, drawing on my experience helping families navigate medical crises while maintaining hope and emotional resilience. These professional opportunities represented more than career advancement. They validated my decision to prioritize my own growth rather than constantly sacrificing my potential to solve other people's problems. For years, I'd turned down overtime opportunities, declined additional training, and limited my professional networking because family crises always seemed to require immediate attention. Now, with boundaries in place and financial stability achieved, I could finally pursue the career I'd always wanted. My relationship with James had also begun attracting positive attention from his military colleagues and the broader Harborview Hills community. Several of James's fellow officers had mentioned how much happier and more confident he seemed since our engagement, and their spouses had welcomed me into their social circle with genuine warmth. This represented the kind of stable, supportive community I'd never experienced, where relationships were based on mutual respect rather than financial utility. The wedding planning had also allowed me to demonstrate my organizational skills and attention to detail in a context that brought joy rather than stress. I'd coordinated with vendors, managed timelines, and handled logistics with the same precision I applied to patient care, but for a celebration rather than a crisis. James often commented on how natural I seemed in this role, managing complex arrangements while maintaining enthusiasm for the process. Most importantly, my savings account, containing the wedding venue deposit, represented something I'd never possessed before. Money that was truly mine, saved for my own priorities, protected from family emergencies and manipulation. The $25,000 wasn't just payment for a venue. It symbolized my ability to plan for happiness rather than constantly preparing for disaster. This was the context in which my parents chose to strike. I wasn't a struggling recent graduate living paycheck to paycheck, vulnerable to their financial manipulation because I had no alternatives. I was a successful professional with career momentum, a loving relationship with a supportive partner, financial stability, and for the first time, genuine happiness about my future.
Their theft didn't just take money, it attacked the foundation of the new life I had worked so hard to build. They chose to destroy my wedding plans, not because they were desperate, but because my success and happiness threatened their ability to control me through financial crisis. The timing wasn't coincidental, it was strategic, designed to pull me back into their dysfunction precisely when I'd finally escaped it. What they didn't anticipate was that this time, I wouldn't be facing their manipulation alone, and my new family had resources and principles that would make their financial abuse far more expensive than they ever imagined. The morning that changed everything started like any other Tuesday in my carefully constructed new life. I'd risen at 5:30 a.m. for my usual pre-shift routine, coffee while reviewing patient charts, a quick scan of medical journals to stay current with best practices, and the peaceful 30 minutes I'd claimed for myself before diving into the controlled chaos of pediatric cardiac care. This ritual had become sacred to me, representing the stability and self-care that I'd never been able to prioritize when my life revolved around managing other people's emergencies.
I was particularly focused that morning because we had a complex case coming in later. A 7-year-old girl named Emma who would be undergoing her second open-heart surgery to repair complications from a previous procedure. Her parents, the Hendersons, had specifically requested that I be part of her care team, having developed trust in my ability to explain complex medical situations in ways that helped them maintain hope while understanding reality. These kinds of professional relationships represented everything I loved about my career and reminded me why I had fought so hard to protect my professional growth from family interference. As I prepared for my shift, my phone sat silently on the kitchen counter of my small but peaceful apartment in Riverside Gardens, a modest complex that I'd chosen specifically because it was far enough from my parents' house to provide psychological distance while remaining close enough to the hospital for my regular schedule. The apartment represented my first real independence, a space where my decisions mattered, where my priorities took precedence, and where I could build the kind of life I'd always wanted. The text arrived at exactly 6:47 a.m., just as I was gathering my nursing supplies and checking my bag for the specialized equipment I'd need for Emma's post-surgical care. The timing would later seem particularly cruel, arriving just as I was mentally preparing to care for a child whose parents trusted me to help protect their daughter's future. The irony of receiving news about my own family's betrayal while preparing to support another family through their medical crisis wasn't lost on me. Sold Oceanview Manor. Family emergency. Your brother needed help. The deposit will cover it. Wedding can wait. Family comes first. The message appeared on my screen with my father's contact name. Those 43 words that would shatter the careful stability I'd spent years building. My initial reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion so profound that I read the message 3 times before my brain could process what Gregory was actually telling me. Sold Oceanview Manor? The venue that I had booked 18 months ago that required my grandmother's $25,000 inheritance as a deposit that was supposed to host our wedding in just 6 weeks? The venue where James and I had spent hours planning table arrangements, where Catherine had helped me envision the ceremony setup, where Admiral Ashworth had personally inspected the security arrangements to ensure his family's safety during the celebration? The physical sensation of reading those words was unlike anything I'd experienced. My hands began trembling so violently that I nearly dropped my phone, and a cold wave of nausea swept through me as the implications began to register. This wasn't just about money, though $25,000 represented more money than my family had ever handled responsibly. This was about the systematic destruction of the most important day of my life. The dissolution of months of careful planning and the humiliation of having to explain to 150 guests that my wedding had been canceled because my parents had stolen the venue deposit. But beyond the practical implications, the emotional betrayal cut deeper than any previous family financial manipulation. My parents had taken money before, borrowed without repaying, and manipulated me into solving their crises, but they'd never directly attacked my happiness. They'd never stolen something that represented my future rather than my past. They'd never forced me to choose between family loyalty
and my own wedding day. I called my father immediately, my hands still shaking as I dialed his number. The call went straight to voicemail, which in retrospect was clearly intentional. Gregory had delivered his devastating news via text specifically to avoid immediate confrontation, giving himself time to prepare his justifications and emotional manipulations before facing my response. This calculated approach to delivering traumatic information would later become evidence of just how premeditated their theft had been. Desperate for clarification, I called my mother Linda, knowing she'd be awake and preparing for her early shift at the dental office. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice carrying that artificially cheerful tone she always used when delivering bad news disguised as family solidarity. "Catalina, honey, I'm glad you called. Your father was worried about how you'd react to the news about the venue." Her phrasing was immediately telling, not how you'd react to what we did, but how you'd react to the news, as if my parents were simply messengers delivering information about an unfortunate event rather than the architects of a devastating betrayal. "Mom, please, tell me this is some kind of mistake. You can't have actually sold my wedding venue." My voice sounded strange to my own ears, high-pitched and desperate in a way that reminded me of how I'd sounded as a child when begging my parents to reconsider some arbitrary punishment or disappointing decision. "Well, technically, your father handled all the arrangements with the venue manager. It turns out that when you signed the original contract, there were provisions for family financial emergencies that allowed for deposit transfers under certain circumstances." Even as she spoke, I could hear the careful preparation in her words, the way she'd practiced this explanation to make their theft sound like a legitimate business transaction.
The lie was so audacious that it took my breath away. I'd read every word of the Oceanview Manor contract multiple times, had negotiated specific terms with the venue coordinator, and had received copies of all documentation. There were no provisions for family financial emergencies, no clauses that would allow anyone other than James or me to make changes to our booking, and certainly no mechanism for transferring our deposit to cover someone else's debts. That's not true, Mom. I read the entire contract. There are no provisions for family emergencies, and only James and I are authorized to make changes to the booking. My voice was getting stronger as the initial shock gave way to clarity about what had actually happened. "Well, your father explained the situation to the venue manager, and she was very understanding about helping a family in crisis. Damien owes some very dangerous people, Catalina. They weren't making idle threats. Your brother could have been seriously hurt if we hadn't found a way to raise the money immediately." The familiar pattern was already emerging. Crisis creation, emotional manipulation, and the expectation that I would prioritize Damien's poor decisions over my own life plans. But this time, the stakes were higher than any previous family emergency. This time, they weren't just asking me to sacrifice money. They were demanding that I sacrifice my wedding, my relationship with James, and my standing with the Ashworth family. "Mom, that money wasn't yours to use. That was my inheritance from Grandma Patricia, specifically left to me for my wedding. You had no legal right to touch it." I was fighting to keep my voice professional, drawing on the same calm authority I use when advocating for patients' families during medical crises. "Oh, honey, don't be so dramatic about legal rights. We're family. Your grandmother would have wanted us to help each other in emergencies. Besides, you're marrying into wealth now. The Ashworths can certainly help with a new venue arrangement." The casual dismissal of both my grandmother's wishes and my autonomy was breathtaking in its audacity. But it was her final comment about the Ashworths that revealed the true calculation behind their theft. My parents hadn't just stolen my wedding deposit. They deliberately created a crisis that would force me to ask James's family for financial help. They were gambling that my desperation to save my wedding would drive me to request assistance from Admiral Ashworth, potentially creating an obligation that could be leveraged for future financial gain.
The Ashworths aren't responsible for cleaning up our family's messes, Mom. Damien's gambling debts aren't their problem, and my wedding costs aren't their obligation. I was surprised by the firmness in my own voice, the clarity of boundaries that I'd never been able to articulate during previous family crises. Well, that's a very selfish way to look at family relationships. Your brother is in real danger, and all you can think about is your party. I'm disappointed in you, Catalina. Your grandmother raised you to put family first. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but the fundamental positions had been established. My parents had stolen my wedding deposit to pay Damien's gambling debts. They felt completely justified in their actions, and they expected me to either accept the situation gracefully or humiliate myself by begging the Ashworths for financial rescue. As I ended the call and sat in my kitchen trying to process what had just happened, one thought kept echoing through my mind. This was different. This wasn't just another family financial crisis that I could absorb and move past. This was a direct attack on my future, my relationship, and my ability to build a life independent of their dysfunction. What my parents didn't know was that in exactly 4 hours, I would be calling James to explain what had happened. And James, being the man of honor and integrity that he was, would immediately call his father. Admiral Theodore Ashworth would receive a detailed briefing about my family's latest financial manipulation by 2 p.m. that afternoon. And that's when my parents would discover the difference between stealing from their daughter and stealing from Admiral Theodore Ashworth's future daughter-in-law. The full scope of my parents' betrayal revealed itself over the next several hours. Like a slow-motion catastrophe, each new detail more devastating than the last. What I'd initially understood as the theft of my venue deposit was actually the tip of an iceberg of deception that had been months in the planning. By the time I finished my shift at Riverside Children's Hospital that evening, I realized I wasn't dealing with a family emergency that had gotten out of hand. I was looking at a calculated campaign of financial sabotage designed to destroy my independence and force me back into their cycle of crisis and dependency.
The first hint that this was bigger than venue theft came during my lunch break when I called Oceanview Manor directly, hoping against hope that there had been some mistake, that my parents had somehow misunderstood the situation, or that the venue manager had been confused about authorization procedures. The conversation with Rebecca Martinez, the events coordinator who'd worked with James and me for over a year, shattered any remaining illusions about innocent misunderstandings. "Ms. Reeves, I'm so sorry about your family situation," Rebecca said, her voice carrying genuine sympathy that immediately alarmed me. "Your father was very emotional when he explained about your brother's accident and the medical expenses. It must be so difficult to have to choose between your wedding and your brother's emergency surgery." Emergency surgery? Medical expenses? I felt the blood drain from my face as Rebecca continued describing the elaborate fiction my father had constructed to justify canceling my wedding. According to Gregory's story, Damien had been in a serious car accident and required immediate surgery that wasn't covered by insurance. The family was facing medical bills that could reach $100,000, and postponing my wedding was the only way to free up funds for his life-saving treatment. "I have to ask," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady. "Did my father provide any medical documentation for my brother's supposed accident?" Rebecca paused. "Well, he was quite distraught, and we don't typically require medical proof for family emergencies. He did mention that your brother was at Millbrook General Hospital, and he seemed very knowledgeable about the medical terminology." Of course he did. Gregory had lived with me for years, listening to me discuss my nursing work, learning medical terminology, and absorbing enough healthcare knowledge to convincingly fake a family medical crisis. The sophistication of his deception was breathtaking and terrifying. But Rebecca's next revelation was even worse. "Your father also mentioned that you'd spoken with your fiancé's family about temporarily postponing the wedding until your brother recovered.
He said the Ashworths were very understanding and had offered to help with any expenses related to rebooking once your family's situation stabilized. My heart stopped. Gregory hadn't just stolen my wedding deposit, he'd explicitly claimed that James and his family were aware of and supportive of the cancellation. He'd used the Ashworth name to legitimize his theft, dragging them into his web of lies without their knowledge or consent. This meant that when the truth came out, the Ashworths wouldn't just learn that my family had stolen from me, they'd discover that their name and reputation had been used to facilitate that theft. I ended the call with Rebecca and immediately tried calling James, but his phone went straight to voicemail. As a lieutenant commander, his schedule was often unpredictable, and he might be in meetings or training exercises where personal calls weren't possible. I left a message asking him to call me urgently about a family emergency, then spent the rest of my shift in a fog of anxiety and growing rage. The second major revelation came when I called Damien directly during my afternoon break. If my parents were using his supposed medical emergency as justification for stealing my wedding money, I needed to know whether he was complicit in their scheme or simply another victim of their manipulation. The answer was worse than I had imagined. Damien answered his phone on the second ring, and his voice was perfectly healthy. No hint of injury, surgery, or medical trauma. "Hey sis, Dad said you might be calling. Pretty crazy about the wedding venue situation, right? But don't worry, he's got it all figured out." "Damien, what exactly did Dad tell you about the wedding venue?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Just that you and James decided to postpone the wedding for a few months so you could help me out with this gambling debt situation. Dad said James's family was cool with it since they've got connections for booking better venues anyway. Pretty generous of you, honestly. I know how much that wedding meant to you." The casual way he discussed my sacrificed wedding as a favor I'd voluntarily provided was almost more infuriating than my parents' outright theft. Damien genuinely believed that I had agreed to postpone my wedding to solve his gambling problem. He'd been told that James and his family were supportive of this decision. In his mind, this wasn't theft. It was family cooperation that everyone had consensually arranged. "Damien, I want you to listen to me very carefully," I said, my voice shaking with controlled fury. "I did not agree to postpone my wedding. I did not authorize Dad to cancel my venue. James and his family know nothing about any of this. Dad stole my wedding deposit to pay your gambling debts, and he's been lying to everyone about having permission to do it." The silence that followed lasted nearly 30 seconds. When Damien finally spoke, his voice had changed completely. "Wait, what? That can't be right. Dad said you'd talk to James about it. He said the Ashworths were helping to find you a new venue." "Dad lied to you, just like he lied to the venue coordinator, and just like he's been lying to me. Tell me about these gambling debts, Damien. How much do you actually owe, and to whom?"
What emerged from our conversation was a picture of financial irresponsibility so staggering that it made my parents' theft seem almost logical by comparison. Damien hadn't just accumulated gambling debts. He'd borrowed money from multiple sources using different stories and justifications. He owed $15,000 to a casino in Riverside Heights, another $8,000 to a private poker group that met weekly in downtown Millbrook, and an additional $12,000 to what he described as some guys who loan money to people with bad credit. But the most alarming detail was that these debts weren't recent. Damien had been accumulating gambling obligations for over 6 months, and my parents had known about the situation for at least 3 months. This meant that the theft of my wedding venue deposit wasn't a desperate response to a sudden crisis. It was the culmination of a long-term plan to use my inheritance to solve a problem they'd been watching develop for months. "Why didn't anyone tell me about this before?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Dad said not to worry you since you were busy with wedding planning and work stress. He said he and Mom would figure out a solution that didn't interfere with your big day." Damien's voice carried genuine confusion and growing alarm as he began to understand the true scope of our parents' deception.
The third revelation came in a text message from my cousin Riley, Linda's sister's daughter, who lived across town and occasionally served as the family's unofficial information network. Heard about Damien's gambling problem. Sorry your parents are dealing with this stress right before your wedding. How are you holding up? Riley's message confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. My parents had been discussing Damien's gambling debts with extended family members for weeks, possibly months. They'd been laying the groundwork for a major financial crisis, preparing relatives for the possibility that significant money would be needed to solve the problem. The theft of my wedding deposit wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the execution of a carefully planned strategy. I called Riley immediately, and her information filled in the final pieces of the puzzle. According to family conversations she'd overheard, my parents had initially hoped that Damien's gambling debts could be resolved through smaller borrowing from multiple family members. They'd approached aunts, uncles, and cousins about lending money for various fabricated emergencies, but the amounts they'd been able to raise weren't sufficient to cover Damien's total obligations. Your mom seemed really stressed about the whole situation, Riley explained. She mentioned that they'd looked into second mortgages and personal loans, but their credit wasn't good enough. She said something about how lucky it was that you had inherited money specifically for your wedding because it meant the family had resources available for real emergencies. The phrase, lucky it was that you inherited money, revealed the fundamental mindset behind their theft. My parents didn't view my grandmother's inheritance as my personal property. They saw it as family resources that happened to be temporarily under my control. In their minds, using my wedding money to solve Damien's gambling problem wasn't theft, it was resource reallocation during a family emergency. But the most alarming detail Riley shared was about timing. Your dad mentioned that they needed to resolve this before your wedding because having Damien's creditors causing problems during the ceremony would be embarrassing for everyone. He said it was better to deal with the crisis now so that your wedding day could be perfect. The twisted logic was almost impressive. My parents had stolen my wedding deposit to ensure that my wedding day wouldn't be disrupted by my brother's gambling creditors. They had destroyed my wedding to protect my wedding. The cognitive dissonance required to rationalize this theft was breathtaking. As I pieced together the full scope of their deception during my drive home from the hospital, I realized that my parents had committed multiple levels of fraud. They'd lied to the venue coordinator about medical emergencies and authorization. They'd forged my signature on cancellation documents. They'd used the Ashworth family name to legitimize their theft. They'd deceived Damien about my consent and James's involvement. And they prepared extended family members to view my sacrificed wedding as evidence of my generosity rather than their theft. But perhaps most importantly, I realized that this wasn't just about solving Damien's current gambling debts. My parents had deliberately created a crisis that would force me to choose between family loyalty and personal boundaries. They were gambling that my love for my brother and my fear of family conflict would make me accept their theft and rebuild my wedding plans around their financial manipulation. What they hadn't calculated was that this time I wouldn't be making that choice alone. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot, I'd already decided that James needed to know everything immediately. And once James knew, Admiral Ashworth would know. And once Admiral Ashworth knew that his family's name had been used to facilitate theft from his future daughter-in-law, my parents would discover that some people don't just get angry when they're stolen from, they get strategic.
James called me back at 7:23 p.m. while I was sitting in my apartment, surrounded by wedding planning materials that now felt like evidence of a life that had been stolen from me. His voice carried the warm concern that had drawn me to him from our first meeting, but I could hear the underlying tension that meant he'd sensed something serious in my voicemail. "Catalina, what's going on? Your message sounded urgent. Is everything okay with your family?" The irony of his question almost made me laugh. Everything was definitely not okay with my family, but not in any way he could have imagined. "James, I need to tell you something, and it's going to be difficult to hear. My parents canceled our wedding venue this morning and used our deposit to pay my brother's gambling debts."
The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear his breathing change. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the controlled calm of someone trained to process crisis information methodically. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Did you say they canceled Oceanview Manor?" I spent the next 20 minutes walking James through everything I'd discovered. The fake medical emergency story told to the venue coordinator, Damien's actual gambling debts totaling $35,000, the months of planning that had led to this theft, and most importantly, how my father had claimed that James and Admiral Ashworth were aware of and supportive of the cancellation. "He told the venue coordinator that your family was helping us find a new venue," I explained, my voice breaking slightly. "James, they used your family's name to legitimize their theft. The venue manager thinks you and your father approved of canceling our wedding." The quality of James's silence changed, becoming the kind of stillness that preceded military action. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. "Catalina, I need you to understand something very clearly. My father is going to consider this a direct attack on our family's honor. Using our name without permission to facilitate theft isn't just fraud, it's the kind of insult that Admiral Theodore Ashworth doesn't ignore." "I never wanted to involve your family in my parents' dysfunction," I said, tears finally coming. "I've spent our entire relationship trying to keep their financial manipulation separate from what we're building together." "And that's exactly why this is so much worse," James replied. "You've protected us from their behavior for 18 months, and they repaid that discretion by dragging us into their crimes without our knowledge. My father is going to view this as a betrayal of your loyalty to our family, even though you're clearly the victim here." James's words crystallized something I hadn't fully understood. My parents hadn't just stolen my wedding money, they'd attacked my position within the Ashworth family. By claiming that James and Admiral Ashworth supported their theft, they'd potentially damaged my credibility and standing with the people who'd welcomed me as a daughter. Even though I was innocent, the mere association with such deception could undermine the trust I'd worked so hard to earn. "What do we do now?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation. "First, I'm coming to get you. You shouldn't be alone right now. Second, we're going to my parents' house and you're going to tell my father exactly what happened. He needs to hear this directly from you before he hears it from anyone else." The drive to the Ashworth estate in Harborview Hills felt like traveling to my own execution. James had called ahead to inform his parents that we needed to discuss an urgent family matter, and I could only imagine Admiral Ashworth's reaction when he learned that his family's name had been used to facilitate theft. The man who'd built a shipping empire through strategic thinking and decisive action would not appreciate being manipulated by small-time criminals, regardless of their relationship to his future daughter-in-law. Admiral Ashworth was waiting for us in his study, a room that reflected both his military background and business success. Naval commendations shared wall space with corporate achievement awards, and his desk displayed the kind of organized efficiency that had characterized his entire career. Catherine was there as well, her diplomatic training evident in her composed demeanor despite the late hour and urgent circumstances. "Catalina," Admiral Ashworth said, rising from behind his desk, "James mentioned that you've encountered some difficulties with your family. Please, have a seat and tell us what's happened." I'd rehearsed this conversation during the drive, but facing Admiral Ashworth's direct gaze made all my planned explanations evaporate. Instead, I found myself simply stating the facts. "My parents stole the deposit for our wedding venue this morning to pay my brother's gambling debts. They told the venue coordinator that you and James had approved the cancellation and were helping us find a new venue."
Admiral Ashworth's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the atmosphere of the room. Catherine's sharp intake of breath was the only sound as the implications of my words settled. Finally, Admiral Ashworth spoke, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that had commanded naval fleets. "Are you telling me that your parents used my family's name to legitimize theft?" "Yes, sir. They've been planning this for months. My brother owes $35,000 to gambling creditors, and my parents decided that my inheritance from my grandmother was family money that could be used to solve the crisis. Admiral Ashworth turned to James. What verification do we have of these claims? James had come prepared. I've already contacted Oceanview Manor and spoken with Rebecca Martinez, the events coordinator. She confirmed that Gregory Reeves canceled the booking this morning, claiming family medical emergency and stating that we were aware of and supportive of the decision. She's willing to provide written documentation of their conversation. And the gambling debts? Admiral Ashworth asked. Catalina spoke with her brother directly. He confirmed owing money to 3 different sources: Riverside Heights Casino, a private poker group, and unlicensed lenders. He was under the impression that Catalina had voluntarily agreed to postpone the wedding to help him. Admiral Ashworth was quiet for several minutes, processing information with the same methodical approach he'd once applied to naval strategic planning. When he finally spoke, his words were measured but carried unmistakable steel. Catalina, I want you to understand that this situation extends far beyond the theft of your wedding deposit. Your parents have committed fraud by forging your signature on venue cancellation documents. They've engaged in identity theft by using our family's name without authorization. They've damaged our family's reputation with vendors we'll likely work with again. And they've created a situation where our future daughter-in-law is associated with criminal activity. The word criminal hit me like a physical blow. I'd been thinking of my parents' actions as family dysfunction taken too far, but Admiral Ashworth was right. What they'd done constituted multiple crimes. Sir, I never wanted any of this to affect your family. I've tried for years to keep my parents' financial problems separate from my relationship with James, and that discretion is precisely why their actions are so unconscionable, Admiral Ashworth replied. You've protected our family from their dysfunction, and they've repaid that loyalty by dragging us into their criminal enterprise without our knowledge or consent. Catherine spoke for the first time. Catalina, dear, you must understand that Theodore isn't angry with you. He's angry for you. What your parents have done is a betrayal of the worst kind. They've stolen not just your money, but your trust, your security, and your peace of mind during what should be the happiest time of your life. Admiral Ashworth stood and walked to the window overlooking the harbor, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture I'd learned indicated serious strategic thinking. James, I assume your fiancé's parents expect this theft to be absorbed quietly, with perhaps some negotiation about repayment schedules and family reconciliation? Based on their previous behavior patterns, yes, sir. They've trained Catalina to accept their financial manipulation by framing it as family loyalty and making resistance seem selfish. And they're probably counting on our family's desire to avoid wedding complications to pressure us to simply cover the stolen funds and moving forward with alternative venue arrangements. That would be consistent with their apparent strategy, yes, sir. Admiral Ashworth turned back to face us, and I saw in his expression the kind of cold determination that had made him legendary in both military and business circles. Then they've made a serious miscalculation. I don't negotiate with thieves, I don't enable criminal behavior, and I certainly don't allow my family to be manipulated by people who mistake kindness for weakness. What are you saying? I asked, though part of me already knew. I'm saying that your parents are about to learn that stealing from Admiral Theodore Ashworth's family comes with consequences they never imagined. They wanted to involve us in their criminal activities? Very well. Now they'll discover what happens when they get our full attention. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as Admiral Ashworth's words settled.
I realized that my parents had made the kind of strategic error that military historians wrote about. They'd attacked an opponent whose resources and determination far exceeded their ability to comprehend or counter. Catalina, I want you to call your parents and arrange a meeting for tomorrow evening. Tell them that James and I would like to discuss the situation and explore options for resolving the venue crisis. Be vague about our intentions, but make it clear that we're taking their theft seriously and want to address it directly. Sir, are you sure that's wise? My parents can be very manipulative when they feel cornered. Admiral Ashworth's smile was not reassuring. My dear, your parents have spent years manipulating someone who loves them and wants to maintain family harmony. Tomorrow, they'll be dealing with someone who has no emotional investment in their well-being and unlimited resources for ensuring that justice is served. I suspect they'll find the experience educational.
As James and I left the Ashworth estate that night, I understood that everything was about to change. My parents had spent my entire adult life training me to absorb their financial abuse quietly, to prioritize family peace over personal boundaries, and to accept their manipulation as the price of maintaining relationships. But they'd never faced consequences administered by someone with Admiral Theodore Ashworth's resources, connections, and absolute commitment to protecting his family. Tomorrow, they would discover that some battles can't be won through emotional manipulation, and that some opponents don't fight fair. They fight to win. The meeting was set for 7 p.m. at my parents' house in Millbrook Heights, and I spent the entire day in a state of nervous anticipation that felt like waiting for a controlled detonation. Admiral Ashworth had been very specific about the arrangements. I was to call my parents and request a family meeting to discuss solutions for the wedding venue situation. James and his father would arrive as concerned family members, wanting to help resolve the crisis. And under no circumstances was I to hint at the true nature of what was about to unfold. When I called my mother that morning, her relief was palpable. "Oh, Catalina, I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. Your father was worried that you might react emotionally instead of thinking about what's best for the family. Having James and Admiral Ashworth involved will make everything so much easier to resolve." The irony of her words was almost suffocating. Linda genuinely believed that Admiral Ashworth's involvement would make their theft easier to resolve, presumably because they expected him to simply write a check to cover their criminal activities and restore family harmony. They had no concept of what they'd actually summoned to their modest suburban home. Admiral Ashworth spent the day making what he casually referred to as preliminary inquiries into my family situation. By afternoon, he'd compiled a comprehensive dossier that would have impressed military intelligence analysts. Through his extensive network of business contacts, military connections, and financial industry relationships, he'd obtained detailed information about every aspect of my parents' lives that would be relevant to the evening's confrontation. "Your father's construction business is in considerably worse shape than you probably realize," Admiral Ashworth explained during our briefing session at his estate. "He owes $47,000 to various suppliers, has 3 active lawsuits from clients claiming incomplete work, and hasn't filed proper tax returns in 18 months. Your mother's employment at the dental office is also precarious. There have been complaints about discrepancies in patient billing that suggest potential embezzlement." The scope of my parents' financial dysfunction was staggering, but Admiral Ashworth was just getting started. "Your brother Damien's gambling debts are actually closer to $50,000 when you include credit card advances he's taken specifically for gambling. He's also facing potential criminal charges for writing bad checks to cover casino markers. The dangerous people he owes money to are primarily organized crime associates who consider debt collection a form of business expansion." Each revelation made it clearer that my parents' theft of my wedding deposit wasn't desperation. It was the latest move in a pattern of criminal financial behavior that had been escalating for years.
They weren't struggling family members making poor decisions under pressure. They were systematic fraudsters who had targeted me as their most reliable source for cover for their crimes. The most interesting discovery, Admiral Ashworth continued, is that your parents have been using your name and credit information for far longer than you realize. They've opened credit accounts using your social security number, listed you as a co-applicant on loans you never signed, and even filed tax returns claiming you as a dependent while you've been supporting yourself financially. The identity theft was so extensive that Admiral Ashworth had needed to involve forensic accountants to trace the full scope of my parents' crimes. They'd been systematically destroying my credit and financial reputation while positioning themselves to benefit from my nursing income and professional stability. Sir, what exactly are you planning to do with this information? I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of what had been uncovered. Admiral Ashworth's smile was the kind that had once made enemy naval commanders reconsider their strategic positions. I'm going to offer your parents a choice, Catalina. They can accept responsibility for their crimes and face the consequences like adults, or they can continue their pattern of manipulation and discover what happens when someone with unlimited resources decides to hold them accountable. The drive to my parents' house felt like approaching a battlefield where the outcome had already been determined, but the casualties had yet to be calculated. James sat beside me in the back of Admiral Ashworth's Mercedes as his hand squeezed mine as we reviewed the evening's strategy one final time. Remember, Admiral Ashworth said, your parents expect us to be supplicants, hoping to negotiate a solution to their crisis. They believe we're coming to discuss how the Ashworth family can help resolve their theft. They have no concept that we're actually here to deliver consequences.
When we arrived at the modest two-story house where I'd grown up, my parents were waiting with the kind of nervous excitement usually reserved for job interviews or important social occasions. My father, Gregory, had put on his best suit. My mother, Linda, was wearing the pearl necklace she'd stolen from my grandmother's jewelry. And even Damien had bothered to shower and dress presentably for the meeting. Admiral Ashworth, what an honor to have you in our home, Gregory said, extending his hand with the kind of artificial confidence that had convinced me for years that he was handling family problems competently. James, good to see you again. I know the situation with the venue has been stressful, but I'm confident we can work out arrangements that benefit everyone. Admiral Ashworth shook my father's hand with the precise politeness he'd perfected during decades of diplomatic military functions. Mr. Reeves, thank you for accommodating this meeting. As I'm sure you understand, family members who are affected by significant decisions prefer to discuss solutions directly rather than relying on second-hand information. The subtle emphasis on affected by significant decisions should have warned my parents that this conversation wouldn't follow their expected script, but they were too focused on their anticipated financial windfall to recognize the threat. We sat in my parents' living room, the same space where I'd endured countless family financial crises, listened to endless justifications for their poor decisions, and been guilt-tripped into solving problems I hadn't created. The familiar furniture and decorations felt surreal as the setting for what I knew would be the final act of my family's manipulation. Admiral Ashworth, Linda began, her voice carrying the practiced sweetness she used when asking for money, we're so grateful that you're willing to help us navigate this difficult situation. Family emergencies can be so challenging, and having your wisdom and resources available makes everything so much more manageable. Admiral Ashworth listened to my mother's prepared speech with the patience of someone who'd spent decades allowing enemies to reveal their strategies before responding. When she finished, he placed a leather portfolio on the coffee table between us. Mrs. Reeves, I appreciate your confidence in my ability to help resolve family emergencies. However, before we discuss solutions, I think it's important that we establish a clear understanding of exactly what situation we're addressing.
He opened the portfolio and began removing documents with the methodical precision of a military briefing. I have here copies of the Oceanview Manor cancellation paperwork, which show that your husband forged your daughter's signature and claimed authorization he didn't possess. I have documentation of your son's gambling debts, which total closer to $50,000 than the $35,000 you've disclosed. I have evidence of credit accounts opened in your daughter's name without her knowledge, tax returns filed fraudulently, and business loans obtained using false information. The color drained from my parents' faces as Admiral Ashworth continued laying out evidence of their crimes with the same calm authority he'd once used to brief Pentagon officials on strategic operations. I also have here, he placed additional documents on the table, detailed financial records showing that your daughter has provided over $67,000 in loans, payments, and contributions to your family over the past 8 years, none of which has been repaid or properly documented. Gregory tried to interrupt. Admiral, I think there's been some misunderstanding about our family arrangements. Mr. Reeves, I am not here to discuss your family arrangements. I am here to address the theft of $25,000 for my future daughter-in-law, the fraudulent use of my family's name to legitimize that theft, and the pattern of criminal financial behavior that made such theft seem reasonable to you. The room fell silent as the true nature of the evening's meeting became clear. My parents realized they weren't being offered assistance. They were being confronted by someone with the resources and determination to hold them accountable for years of criminal behavior. Now, Admiral Ashworth continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling the room with unmistakable authority. We're going to discuss the terms of your surrender, the timeline for restitution, and the consequences you'll face if you fail to comply with my requirements. My parents exchanged glances that revealed their dawning comprehension. They had badly miscalculated the kind of opponent they were facing. Admiral Theodore Ashworth hadn't come to negotiate. He'd come to dictate terms of defeat. What followed was not a negotiation. It was a masterclass in strategic dominance delivered by someone who had spent decades outmaneuvering opponents with far more sophisticated capabilities than my small-time criminal parents. Admiral Ashworth didn't raise his voice, didn't make threats, and didn't engage in emotional manipulation. Instead, he systematically dismantled every assumption my parents had made about their ability to control this situation. Let me begin by clarifying your current position, Admiral Ashworth said, removing additional documents from his portfolio with the measured precision of someone laying out chess pieces. Mr. Reeves, your construction business has violated contractor licensing requirements in 17 separate instances over the past 2 years. Mrs. Reeves, your employment at Millbrook Dental Associates is currently under investigation for billing discrepancies that suggest systematic embezzlement totaling approximately $23,000.
My mother's face went white. How do you know about... Mrs. Reeves, I know about your employment situation because Dr. Patterson, the practice owner, is a member of my country club and a longtime family friend. When I mentioned during yesterday's golf game that my future daughter-in-law's family was facing some financial difficulties, he was very forthcoming about the irregularities he's discovered in patient billing and insurance claims processing. The casual mention of their professional vulnerabilities being discussed over golf was devastating. My parents had assumed their crimes were hidden in bureaucratic anonymity, not realizing that Admiral Ashworth's social and business connections created a surveillance network that extended into every aspect of their lives. Damien, Admiral Ashworth continued, turning to my brother with the same calm authority, your gambling debts have attracted attention from the Riverside County District Attorney's Office. Writing checks with insufficient funds to cover casino markers constitutes check fraud under state law. The amounts involved elevate your crimes to felony level, carrying potential sentences of 3 to 5 years in state prison. Damien looked genuinely shocked. I didn't know writing bad checks was that serious. Ignorance of the law is not a defense, particularly when the pattern suggests systematic intent to defraud. The fact that you've written 11 separate bad checks to 4 different casinos over 8 months demonstrates knowledge and premeditation that prosecutors find very compelling. Admiral Ashworth's ability to cite specific legal statutes and case precedents wasn't accidental. I later learned that he'd spent the previous day consulting with 3 different law firms, each specializing in different aspects of the crimes my family had committed. He'd essentially war-gamed every possible defense my parents might attempt and prepared counters for each potential strategy. Now, regarding the immediate matter of the stolen wedding deposit, Admiral Ashworth continued, placing a new set of documents on the table. Forging signatures on legal documents constitutes fraud in the first degree. Using my family's name without authorization to legitimize that fraud adds charges of identity theft and conspiracy to commit fraud. The venue coordinator's written statement confirms that Mr. Reeves explicitly claimed to have my permission and support for canceling the wedding. My father tried to regain some semblance of control. Admiral, I think you're blowing this out of proportion. This is a family matter that got complicated, not some kind of criminal conspiracy. Mr. Reeves, let me save you some time by addressing the arguments you're about to make. Admiral Ashworth's voice carried the kind of authoritative patience that had once been used to brief presidents on military strategy. You're going to claim that family emergencies justify extraordinary measures. You're going to suggest that blood relatives have special obligations to help each other during crises. You're going to frame your theft as temporary borrowing that you intended to repay. And you're going to appeal to my desire to avoid wedding complications as justification for overlooking your crimes. The accuracy of his predictions was chilling. I could see my father's prepared talking points dissolving as Admiral Ashworth systematically dismantled each potential defense before it could be presented. However, what you fail to understand is that I don't view this situation through the lens of family dynamics. I view it through the lens of criminal behavior that has targeted someone under my protection. Your daughter's relationship to you is irrelevant. What matters is that you have committed multiple felonies against a member of my family. Admiral Ashworth then produced what he described as supporting documentation that revealed the true scope of his investigation. Bank records showing my parents' systematic theft of my identity for financial gain. Credit reports demonstrating the damage they'd caused to my financial reputation. Employment verification showing that I'd been financially supporting them while they committed crimes in my name. This investigation has also revealed some interesting patterns in your family's financial behavior. Over the past 8 years, Catalina has provided $67,000 in direct financial support to your household. During that same period, you've accumulated approximately $89,000 in undisclosed debts and unpaid obligations. Rather than using her contributions to stabilize your financial situation, you've treated her support as additional borrowing capacity that enabled accelerated spending. The mathematical precision was devastating. Admiral Ashworth had quantified exactly how my parents had weaponized my financial responsibility to fund their increasingly reckless behavior. They hadn't been grateful recipients of family support. They'd been systematic exploiters of my earning capacity. Mrs. Reeves, I'm particularly interested in your credit card activities from the past 18 months. You've made purchases totaling $14,000 using cards that list Catalina as an authorized user, directly damaging her credit score while funding your personal expenses.
These purchases include jewelry, clothing, vacation expenses, and home improvements that provide no benefit to your daughter. Linda's attempted explanation died before she could form words. The evidence was too comprehensive, too precisely documented, and too clearly presented to allow for the kind of emotional manipulation that had worked on me for years. But Admiral Ashworth's most devastating revelation came when he presented documentation of my parents' tax fraud. Mr. and Mrs. Reeves, you've claimed Catalina as a dependent on your tax returns for the past 3 years while she's been living independently and earning $78,000 annually. This has allowed you to claim unearned tax credits totaling approximately $8,400, while potentially subjecting your daughter to IRS penalties for failing to file as required.
The tax fraud was particularly serious because it involved federal agencies with unlimited resources for investigation and prosecution. Unlike local financial crimes that might be resolved through plea bargaining, federal tax fraud carried mandatory penalties that couldn't be negotiated away through family connections or sob stories. I've also discovered that Mr. Reeves has been using Catalina's Social Security number to obtain credit that she's unaware of, Admiral Ashworth continued. 3 active credit accounts totaling $19,000 in debt appear on her credit report, none of which she authorized or benefited from. This identity theft has been occurring for approximately 4 years. Each revelation was worse than the last, painting a picture of systematic criminal exploitation that extended far beyond the wedding venue theft. My parents hadn't just stolen my deposit money, they'd been systematically destroying my financial future while positioning themselves to benefit from my success. The total financial damage to Catalina, including direct theft, credit damage, tax complications, and identity theft, exceeds $127,000, Admiral Ashworth concluded. This figure does not include emotional damages, lost opportunities, or the cost of legal remediation required to restore her financial reputation. The number hung in the air like a verdict. $127,000 represented more money than my parents had ever handled honestly, and it quantified years of exploitation that I'd been too conditioned to recognize as criminal. Now, Admiral Ashworth said, closing his portfolio with decisive finality, we're going to discuss how you're going to make restitution for these crimes, what behavioral changes you're going to implement immediately, and what consequences you'll face if you fail to comply with my requirements. My parents sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that they weren't dealing with someone who could be manipulated, guilted, or negotiated with. Admiral Theodore Ashworth had gathered evidence, calculated damages, and prepared consequences with military precision. They were no longer in control of anything. Let me be very clear about something, Admiral Ashworth added, his voice carrying unmistakable finality. This is not a discussion. These are the terms of your surrender. Your only choice is whether you comply voluntarily or face the full legal consequences of your criminal behavior through proper judicial channels. The war was over before my parents realized it had begun. The consequences Admiral Ashworth laid out weren't punishments. They were surgical strikes designed to dismantle my parents' ability to continue their criminal behavior while ensuring they could never again target me or any other family member for financial exploitation. What followed was a lesson in how unlimited resources, combined with military strategic thinking, could reshape reality for people who had operated with impunity for years. Here are your options, Admiral Ashworth began, producing a formal legal document from his portfolio. Option 1, you sign this comprehensive restitution agreement, comply with all behavioral modifications, and accept ongoing oversight of your financial activities. Option 2,
I hand this evidence portfolio to the Riverside County District Attorney's Office tomorrow morning, and you face prosecution from multiple felonies without the benefit of clean negotiations. The restitution agreement was a 23-page document that had clearly been prepared by attorneys specializing in financial crimes. As Admiral Ashworth walked through its terms, the scope of consequences became clear. This wasn't just about recovering stolen money, it was about permanently altering the power dynamics that had enabled years of abuse. First, immediate restitution of $127,000 to cover direct financial damages to Catalina. This includes the $25,000 wedding deposit, $67,000 in unreturned loans and contributions, $19,000 in fraudulent credit accounts, $8,400 in tax fraud benefits, and $7,600 in credit repair costs. My father's face went ashen. "Admiral, we don't have that kind of money. Our total assets don't come close to—" "Mr. Reeves, your financial capacity is irrelevant to your legal obligations. However, the agreement provides structured payment terms that account for your current resources." Admiral Ashworth's tone suggested he'd anticipated this objection and planned accordingly. "Your house will be sold immediately, with proceeds applied to the restitution debt. Based on current market value, this should provide approximately $87,000 after mortgage satisfaction. Your construction business assets, including equipment, vehicles, and pending contracts, will be liquidated to provide an additional $23,000. The remaining $17,000 will be paid through garnished wages over 18 months. The systematic destruction of my parents' financial foundation was breathtaking in its comprehensiveness. Admiral Ashworth hadn't just calculated the damage they had caused, he'd engineered a recovery plan that would strip away every asset they'd accumulated through decades of exploitation. "Mrs. Reeves, your employment at Millbrook Dental Associates will terminate immediately. Dr. Patterson has agreed not to pursue criminal charges for embezzlement in exchange for your resignation and cooperation with restitution. However, your professional references will reflect the circumstances of your departure, making future employment in financial or administrative roles unlikely." Linda's carefully constructed world of respectability crumbled as Admiral Ashworth continued. The social standing she'd maintained through stolen money and fraudulent tax returns would disappear, along with her ability to manipulate financial systems for personal gain.
Damien will enter a residential gambling addiction treatment program within 7 days. The program costs $47,000 for 90 days of intensive treatment, which will be funded through the sale of his vehicle, personal property, and a structured loan that he'll repay through supervised employment. Failure to complete treatment or any return to gambling will result in immediate prosecution for check fraud. My brother's future had been planned with the same military precision that had dismantled my parents' financial crimes. Admiral Ashworth had researched treatment facilities, negotiated placement terms, and arranged financing that would force Damien to take responsibility for his recovery while removing his ability to create future family crises. Additionally, all three of you will be permanently prohibited from using Catalina's personal information for any financial purposes. Credit monitoring services will be established to detect any attempts at identity theft. Violation of this restriction will result in immediate federal prosecution for identity fraud. The ongoing oversight wasn't just punitive, it was protective, ensuring that my parents could never again use my success as the foundation for their criminal activities. Admiral Ashworth had essentially built a firewall between my financial life and their destructive behavior. Furthermore, Admiral Ashworth continued, you will have no contact with Catalina except through formal mediation if she chooses to maintain any family relationship. Any attempts to manipulate, guilt, or pressure her regarding financial matters will constitute harassment and will be prosecuted accordingly. The communication restrictions were perhaps the most important consequence because they broke the emotional leverage my parents had used for years to justify their exploitation.
They could no longer frame their theft as family loyalty or make me feel guilty for protecting my own interests. But Admiral Ashworth's most devastating consequence was yet to come. Finally, comprehensive documentation of your financial crimes will be shared with relevant professional and social contacts to ensure that your pattern of exploitation doesn't simply shift to new victims. This includes credit agencies, professional licensing boards, and community organizations where you might seek positions of financial trust. The social consequences would be permanent and far-reaching. My parents' ability to manipulate employers, landlords, creditors, and community members would be eliminated through strategic disclosure of their criminal history. Admiral Ashworth was ensuring that their crimes would follow them for years, preventing them from rebuilding their exploitation network in new locations or with new victims. Mr. and Mrs. Reeves, you have exactly 1 hour to decide whether you'll sign this agreement or face prosecution through the judicial system. I should mention that if you choose prosecution, the evidence I've gathered will ensure conviction on multiple felony charges carrying sentences of 8 to 12 years in federal prison. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Admiral Ashworth had structured the consequences so that compliance with his restitution agreement was obviously preferable to criminal prosecution, while still ensuring that my parents would face meaningful accountability for their crimes. My father made one last attempt at negotiation. "Admiral, surely we can work out modified terms that take into account our family relationships and the emotional complexity of the situation. Mr. Reeves, you forfeited any consideration of family relationships when you committed identity theft against my future daughter-in-law. You forfeited any claim to emotional complexity when you used my family's name to legitimize fraud. These terms are final." The signing ceremony that followed was conducted with the formal precision of a military surrender. Each page was explained in detail, each signature was witnessed and notarized, and copies were distributed to ensure that no one could later claim misunderstanding about the agreement's terms. As my parents signed away their house, their business, their financial freedom, and their ability to continue exploiting family members, I felt something I'd never experienced before. The profound relief of knowing that their manipulation had finally met an immovable obstacle. But Admiral Ashworth wasn't finished. The final consequence was the most personally meaningful to me, though it seemed almost anticlimactic after the systematic destruction of my parents' criminal enterprise. "Catalina, your wedding will take place as originally scheduled. I've purchased Oceanview Manor outright, along with the entire Sapphire Bay Resort property. The venue is now permanently available for family celebrations, and your original wedding plans will proceed without modification." The casual mention of buying an entire resort property to ensure my wedding could proceed as planned was a perfect example of how Admiral Ashworth's resources had transformed this crisis from devastating betrayal into minor inconvenience. My parents' most damaging crime had been undone with a single business transaction. Additionally, all wedding expenses will be covered by the Ashworth family as our gift to celebrate your marriage to James. This includes vendor costs, guest accommodations, and any other expenses you've incurred during planning. You should not suffer financially because of your parents' crimes. The generosity was overwhelming, but more importantly, it represented complete victory over my parents' manipulation. They'd stolen my wedding deposit, expecting to force me to beg the Ashworths for financial assistance. Instead, their theft had resulted in Admiral Ashworth taking personal responsibility for ensuring that my wedding exceeded every dream I'd ever imagined. Finally, Admiral Ashworth concluded, trust funds have been established for your future financial security, including educational expenses if you choose to pursue advanced nursing degrees, emergency funds for unexpected life events, and retirement savings that no family member can access or manipulate.
My parents sat in stunned silence as they realized that their most successful victim had been permanently elevated beyond their reach. Admiral Ashworth had not only punished their crimes, he'd made it impossible for them to ever again use financial pressure to control my life choices. The consequences were swift and comprehensive. Within 2 weeks, my parents had vacated their house, liquidated their assets, and begun making restitution payments. Damien had entered gambling treatment. Linda was working as a part-time clerk at a hardware store after being unable to find administrative work. Gregory was employed as a day laborer after his contractor's license was revoked. Most importantly, they'd disappeared from my life completely, no longer able to create crises that required my intervention or generate guilt that compelled my compliance. Admiral Ashworth had achieved something I'd never believed possible. He'd freed me from my family's manipulation without requiring me to sacrifice my own values or integrity. The boy who'd spent years stealing from his sister was learning accountability in residential treatment. The parents who'd built their lifestyle on systematic exploitation were experiencing poverty for the first time in their adult lives. And the daughter who'd been conditioned to absorb their abuse was finally free to build a life based on her own choices, rather than their crises. 6 months have passed since that confrontation in my parents' living room, and I'm writing this from our honeymoon suite at the Sapphire Bay Resort, the same property Admiral Ashworth purchased to ensure my wedding could proceed as planned. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm staying in a resort my father-in-law bought specifically to undo my parents' theft, but more importantly, I'm finally living a life free from the financial manipulation that had defined my existence for 26 years. Our wedding was everything I dreamed it could be, but with an added layer of meaning that I hadn't anticipated. Standing at the altar of Oceanview Manor, looking out over the bay where James and I had shared so many conversations about our future, I wasn't just marrying the man I loved, I was officially joining a family that understood the difference between support and exploitation. When Admiral Ashworth walked me down the aisle, having offered when my own father forfeited that privilege through his crimes, it felt like a public declaration that some relationships are chosen rather than inherited. The wedding guests included colleagues from Riverside Children's Hospital, James's military friends, members of the Ashworth family's extensive social network, and even some of my extended family members who had learned about my parents' theft and wanted to show their support. What was notably absent was any trace of the financial anxiety that had shadowed every major event in my previous life. No one asked for money, no one created emergencies requiring immediate attention, and no one treated my happiness as a negotiable commodity in their personal financial planning. Dr. Montenegro, my supervisor at the hospital, gave a toast that perfectly captured what this wedding represented. To Catalina, who has spent her career caring for families in crisis and who has finally found a family that cares for her instead of creating crises for her to solve. The applause that followed wasn't just celebration, it was acknowledgement from people who had watched me struggle with family obligations that they'd recognized as unhealthy long before I'd understood them as criminal. But the most meaningful moment came when Admiral Ashworth stood to address the guests during the reception. His speech wasn't about welcoming me to the family. It was about justice, accountability, and the importance of protecting people who have dedicated their lives to serving others. He said, "Some people believe that family loyalty requires accepting abuse disguised as obligation. But real family loyalty means protecting each other from those who would exploit kindness for personal gain. Catalina has learned that being related to someone doesn't give them license to steal from you, and that sometimes the family you choose is more valuable than the family you inherit." The speech was both a public validation of my decision to cut ties with my parents and a warning to anyone who might consider targeting members of the Ashworth family for financial manipulation. Admiral Ashworth had essentially announced that attacking one of us meant facing all of us, and that our resources for ensuring accountability were unlimited. Since the wedding, I've had time to process the full scope of what my parents had done and what Admiral Ashworth's intervention meant for my future.
The financial security he's provided isn't just about money. It's about freedom from the constant anxiety that had characterized my entire adult life. For the first time, I can make decisions based on what I want, rather than what crisis needs to be managed or what family obligation requires my sacrifice. My career has flourished in ways I never imagined possible when I was constantly distracted by family financial emergencies. I've been promoted to nursing supervisor for the entire pediatric cardiac unit, completed certification in advanced pediatric life support, and been accepted into a master's program for healthcare administration that Admiral Ashworth insisted on funding as an investment in my professional development. The trust funds he established have also allowed me to pursue interests and opportunities that were previously impossible. I volunteered with organizations that help families navigate medical crises, drawing on my professional expertise and personal experience with exploitation to help others recognize and resist financial manipulation. This work has been incredibly fulfilling because it allows me to transform my own painful experiences into support for people facing similar challenges. But perhaps the most significant change has been psychological. The constant hypervigilance that had characterized my relationship with money has gradually faded, replaced by a sense of security I'd never experienced. I no longer check my bank account multiple times daily to ensure no one has accessed it without permission. I don't feel guilty about spending money on myself or worry that any financial success will automatically become someone else's emergency fund. James has been instrumental in helping me understand what healthy family relationships look like. His patience with my initial inability to trust that his family's generosity came without hidden obligations or future expectations has been remarkable. He's helped me recognize that the Ashworth's support isn't conditional on my continued usefulness or financial contribution. It's based on genuine affection and respect for who I am as a person. The contrast with my parents' treatment has been educational in ways I'm still processing. The Ashworths celebrate my successes without calculating how those achievements might benefit them financially. They offer assistance without creating obligations or keeping scorecards of who owes what to whom. Most importantly, they respect my boundaries and decisions without threatening withdrawal of support if I don't comply with their preferences. As for my parents and Damien, the consequences Admiral Ashworth implemented have been both swift and permanent. Gregory and Linda are living in a small apartment in a less expensive part of town, both working entry-level jobs that reflect their actual skills, rather than the elevated positions they'd maintained through manipulation and fraud. The house sale, business liquidation, and garnished wages have ensured steady restitution payments, and they're about halfway through paying back the money they stole from me. Damien completed his 90-day gambling treatment program and is now working in a supervised employment situation while attending weekly therapy sessions. His recovery seems genuine, and he's been the only family member to express authentic remorse for his role in the financial manipulation that characterized our family dynamics. He's requested permission to write me a letter of apology, which I'm considering, but haven't yet decided whether to read. The most important lesson I've learned from this experience is that financial abuse within families is often invisible because it's disguised as obligation, loyalty, and temporary assistance. For years, I absorbed my parents' financial crises because I'd been conditioned to believe that refusing would make me selfish, ungrateful, or a bad family member. I didn't recognize that their repeated emergencies weren't unfortunate circumstances. They were planned strategies for extracting money from someone who couldn't say no without feeling guilty. Admiral Ashworth's intervention taught me that having resources and power comes with responsibility to protect people who are being exploited. He didn't just solve my immediate problem. He used his capabilities to ensure that my parents could never again prey on family members or other vulnerable people. His approach wasn't about revenge, it was about creating consequences that would prevent future victims. For anyone watching this who recognizes similarities to their own family situation, I want you to understand several things. First, you don't need to have wealthy in-laws to establish boundaries with financially manipulative family members. What you need is the recognition that being related to someone doesn't give them license to steal from you or destroy your financial security for their benefit. Second, documenting financial exploitation is crucial, even if you never plan to take legal action. Keeping records of loans that aren't repaid, tracking contributions you've made to family emergencies, and noting patterns of manipulation will help you understand the true scope of what's happening and provide evidence if you ever decide to seek accountability. Third, financial abuse often escalates over time. If family members are comfortable taking small amounts or creating minor financial obligations, they'll eventually feel entitled to larger thefts and more serious crimes. The earlier you establish boundaries, the easier it is to prevent the kind of systematic exploitation that characterized my relationship with my parents. Most importantly, you deserve financial security, personal boundaries, and family relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial utility. If family members only value you for your ability to solve their financial problems, then they're not family. They're predators who happen to share your DNA.
The freedom I've gained from cutting ties with financially abusive family members is worth more than any amount of money I gave them over the years. I'm no longer responsible for managing other people's poor decisions, and I'm no longer required to sacrifice my own financial security to maintain family peace. If you're in a similar situation, please know that it's possible to break free from family financial manipulation, establish healthy boundaries, and build relationships based on genuine care rather than financial convenience. Sometimes the family you choose really is more valuable than the family you inherit. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you recognize your own worth and find the courage to protect your own financial future from people who would exploit your kindness. Remember, real love doesn't come with invoices, and family loyalty should never be a one-way transaction. Drop a comment below sharing your own experiences with financially manipulative family members. Hit that like button if this story helped you recognize patterns in your own life, and subscribe for more content about establishing healthy boundaries and protecting yourself from toxic family dynamics. Most importantly, remember that you deserve better than being someone else's emergency fund, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that behavior comes from family members who claim to need your help. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.